Hello and welcome back to the competitive biography of Emanuel Lasker. We're continuing our journey through Lasker's match against Curt von Bardeleben at the tail end of 1889. Once more, if you haven't seen the first video in this series, I'll leave a link to it over there somewhere. You'll want to take a look at that in order to understand the context behind this match. Just like last game, there isn't really anything more that I want to say that hasn't already been said, so let's jump right into today's game. Curt von Bardeleben with white switches things up from game 1 and decides to go with e4 this time around. Lasker continues responding with e5, knight to c3 from von Bardeleben, knight to f6, and now g3. The Mises variation was played twice at the Breslau tournament by this gentleman. Knight to c6 from Lasker, bishop to g2, and bishop to c5. Now, at both of those games at Breslau, von Bardeleben here played knight g to e2. And for example, in the game he played against the Russian master Emanuel Schiffers, play continued d6, castles, bishop to e6, knight to a4, going after the dark squared bishop, and Schiffers responded with a very nice move, queen to d7, preparing to infiltrate on h3. Knight captures c5, d captures c5, and b3 was played, but Schiffers would be the one to go on to win this game. Von Bardeleben deviates slightly by instead playing the move d3 here, but after Lasker's d6, he now plays knight to g to e2. Now, if Lasker were to castle, we would actually transpose to a game we've seen before. This position was seen in Lasker's game against Paul Lipka earlier in the Hauptturnier. However, Lasker decides to keep things in somewhat unique territory by instead playing the move a6. And okay, von Bardeleben castles, we have bishop to e6, and now bishop to g5. Lasker kicks it with h6, and von Bardeleben trades on f6. Now, the move g captures on f6 was the other move played at the Breslau tournament, this one in the game against James Mason. Play continued king to h1, and after h5, f4, this was von Bardeleben's idea all along, h4, and he even got the move h5 in. Von Bardeleben would go on to win this game. Lasker tries to improve on James Mason's play, with queen captures on f6. And after king to h1, once again preparing f4, he decides to go for the move g5. Now, commentators at the time loved this move, as it was supposed to stop von Bardeleben's f-pawn advancing, as it did against James Mason. And so naturally, in this position, Curt von Bardeleben decided to play the move f4. Now the question becomes, to what extent does this g5 move actually stop von Bardeleben from playing f4? Well, g captures on f4 was played, of course, g captures on f4, and now Lasker goes for a novelty. In one more game from the Breslau tournament, played between two completely different people, bishop to g4 was tried. Now from here, it wasn't very impressive. Queen to d2 was played, the trade took place on e2, and black even took here on f4. This seems like it was efficient as it comes with an attack on the b2 pawn. c3 was played to simply defend it, and black ended up castling. This was played in the game between the masters Alexander Fritz and George Gossip, ultimately ending in a draw. Instead of this, Lasker opts to play the move queen to h4. As I said, this move is a novelty, and so it's as of move 12 that the players are playing a unique game. Now, the downside of this queen to h4 move is that it still allows f5 to be played, which it was. The bishop retreated to d7, and now knight to g3. Now, the upside of queen to h4 is that black gets a very aggressive position. And here, the commentators said that h5 is the best move for black, after which black is free to castle queenside and they can begin an attack on the king side and have a lot of fun doing that. However, Lasker decided to castle right away, which objectively speaking is a completely fine move, though it does allow von Bardeleben to play a very interesting reply in queen to h5. This is the point behind knight to g3, and this is why h5 from black was so crucial. Now black is forced to trade queens, which is perfectly fine. Again, black is doing completely fine here, but it does come with a bit of a psychological trick because now he really has to change gears. Here Lasker decided to go with the move knight to d4, which is imprecise. Knight to b4 accomplishes the exact same thing as knight to d4, which is the attack on the c-pawn. The difference is that you want to leave this diagonal open, because after the natural move rook a to c1, black wants to play bishop to e3, kicking the rook. After rook c to e1, bishop to d4 now. And the point is that if the pawn is defended once more, let's say with rook to e2, black is allowed to trade here on c3, and then gobble up the pawn here on a2. The c3 square is going to be immediately available for black, and so white is going to have to prove that they haven't just lost a pawn for absolutely nothing. The issue with Lasker's move of knight to d4 is that after rook a to c1, there is no way to continue this attack. And so in the absence of this, Lasker decides to continue his attack on the queen side with rook d to g8. Now that is unfortunately a mistake. c6 is the best move here, which will be very obvious in a second. The problem is that after rook d to g8, black just doesn't have enough firepower to really initiate much of an attack right away, and white is the one who's going to get the offensive going first with the move knight to d5. Suddenly knight to e7 is a super annoying threat. Now, it was noted in the papers that black doesn't get to simply play king to d8 and avoid the issue, because after c3 kicking the bishop back to c6, this knight is still really well placed on f6. And now let's say rook to f8. The line that they give now, starting with white, goes with rook to f3 and goes on some sort of attack. This is perfectly fine, though you can also very simply just trade here on d7. King captures d7 and now f6. White is just completely dominating the space advantage, and black is going to be suffering for quite some time here. So with king to d8 not really offering all that much, Lasker instead decided to play the move rook to g5. I'll mention that this move was lambasted by the commentators, though it's due to h4 thrusts that never really materialize in the exact way that they think they do. Rook to g5 is a completely fine move. Unfortunately for Lasker, it does nothing to stop knight coming to f6, which it does, and now he plays a move that really does get him in trouble, d5. Now, the justification for this move apparently comes in the line starting with h4. The idea is that black gets to play this move bishop to e7. Their line goes h captures g5, h captures g5. Now you're threatening to win this knight and then this knight, as this one on h5 is pinned. So king to g1 gets out of the pin, but it walks into knight to e2 check. King to f2, knight captures c1, rook captures c1, and the point is that black is supposed to be able to just win their piece back with rook to h6. Their ultimate point is that knight captures on c5, d5, excuse me, falls to bishop to c5. This comes with check, black regains the knight, material is equal, everything's fine. What they missed, and I'm not entirely sure how they missed this, is that white doesn't have to take here on d5, they can just take here on d7. And then after king captures d7, they just defend their knight through literally any means, bishop to f3, and white is just up a piece, as simple as that. So even if black gets what they want, and that this h4 move comes and they get that whole sequence, it's still not good for them. Von Bardeleben, instead of that, decides to simply play c3, which coerces Lasker to play what was the best move instead of d5, simply knight to e2. Now here the move does basically nothing, as after rook c to e1, you would want to play knight to f4, and if the pawn were still on d5, this would be a reasonable move, but now it's just a non-starter as white is able to trade here on f4, and now this pawn is falling, or you can take here on d5. The f4 pawn will probably fall shortly, and white is just up 2 pawns. So with the direct route not bearing much fruit, Lasker decides to try switching things up a little and plays the move bishop to b5. The idea being that after rook captures on e2, bishop captures on d3. So yes, you're going to pick up a rook, you're going to lose 2 pieces, but it's certainly something. After rook f to e1 from von Bardeleben, now we get a bunch of exchanges. D captures e4, rook captures e4, bishop captures e4, knight captures on e4, rook captures h5, and knight captures on c5. A quick material count will show that the players have an even amount of material, however, there is a double attack on the b7 pawn. This forces Lasker to play bishop, b6, excuse me, and now knight captures on a6. So von Bardeleben keeps his 2 pieces in exchange for the rook, which is certainly an advantage, though it's hard to say precisely how much. Lasker is well within his rights to continue playing, and of course Curt von Bardeleben is well within his rights to continue pushing. Now you have to be more careful as Lasker. Of course you don't want to get greedy and take this pawn on f5, because bishop to h3 will really ruin your day. So he instead decides to play the best move, which is rook to d8. Bishop to f3 comes, kicking the rook back to g5, and now rook captures on e5. Now this is going to be a very difficult position for Lasker to defend. It turns out that here the absolute best move is c5, which certainly makes sense when you see the upcoming moves, but in the context of being down material and having to come up with some sort of counterattack, this move really does not come to mind, I don't think. He instead plays a move that makes very intuitive sense, rook to d2. Why not? Get your rook nice and active. The problem here is that first, von Bardeleben gets to play this move h4, very important, creating room for his king. And after rook to g3, this bishop sets itself up on c6. Suddenly Lasker's king is in a little bit of a pickle. A lot of the squares around it have been taken. It's not getting mated yet because rook to d8 will always block checks. But he's going to get in a lot of trouble in the endgame if he's unable to activate his king. So if he's going to suffer, he might as well do it for something. Rook to h3 with check, after king to g1 wins the pawn on h4, but now rook to e8 with check. This forces the rook to slide back to d8, and now rook to e7. The f pawn is attacked, there's a double attack on the c7 pawn. How do you defend here as Lasker? He starts by throwing in a spite check with rook to d1 with check, and after king to d2, rook to c4. The bishop calmly retreats back to b5, and after rook to f4, he decides to take here on c7. The German chess magazine pointed out an incredibly sadistic move here that I just want to point out, knight to b4, which carries the threat of bishop to a6, and suddenly black is very obviously getting mated. Von Bardeleben instead decides to keep things simple. He plays rook captures on c7, and after king to d8, rook captures on f7. He's up 2 pawns and is still completely winning. Lasker doesn't think himself out of this yet, though. He plays the move rook to d5, coming with a fork on the bishop and the pawn. The knight goes to c7 to defend and also attack the rook, and this forces Lasker to be a little bit precise. If he plays rook d captures on f5 here, this loses very quickly, as the sequence knight to e6, king to c8, bishop to a6, king to b8, and now rook to b7 with check. And once the king moves, the exchange on f4 will simply leave white down a piece. So he instead plays the move rook f captures on f5, and after the same sequence, king to c8, bishop to a6, king to b8, rook to b7 with check, king to c8. There are unfortunately no good discoveries here. Rook to h7 is one that immediately comes to mind. After king to b8, you do win this pawn here on h6. White is certainly going to remain up material, but now black gets to play moves like rook to d2 with check, and after, let's say, king to g3, king to a7, kicks the bishop back, and now rook captures on b2. You've split your pawns, and the winning task has been made more difficult. White is certainly still winning, but I'm not sure if this is more winning than the other position. So lacking a good discovery, Von Bardeleben decides to keep things simple and plays knight to d4. Why not? The rook is attacked, and it moves to g5 to give a check. We have king to f3, and now, once more, the question is, what does Lasker play here to hold on to the game? Rook to d6 is given as the most challenging continuation. The point is that if rook captures on b6 with check, king to c7, and this position is certainly going to be winning for white, though this outside h-pawn is going to provide at least some source of counterplay for black. However, if you instead decide to go rook to g7 with check here as white, and after king to d8 and this rook trade, now king to g4, and there's nothing that black can do to stop the h-pawn from falling. Something like rook to g6 falls to king to f5. If you ever go on to a dark square, you're going to get it forked by the knight. And if you go back to g8, then bishop to c4 comes, pokes the rook, the pawn falls, and now white is completely winning. No questions asked. So even in the best case scenario, there's a pretty clear-cut way for Von Bardeleben to get an advantage. We don't get the best scenario here as Lasker plays the move rook to a5, which, if you ask the engine, is completely fine, but obviously this position has just been losing for a while. Rook to a7 with check comes. The point is that if you go to b8, you get mated, and if you go to d8, the knight to c6 comes with a fork anyway, so black is going to be losing material regardless. He instead decided to capture here on a6 on his own terms, and after rook captures a6, king to b7. Lasker is completely losing, and he only draws it out for a little while longer, thankfully. Rook down to a4, and now h5. Knight to e2 is played, stopping the pawn from moving any further. And after king to c6, rook to h4, king to b5, and finally knight to g3. The pawn is attacked twice, and there's nothing Lasker can do to stop that pawn from falling, and so it was here on move 50 that Emanuel Lasker resigned the game. So with this very convincing win, Von Bardeleben has equalized the score in the match, but unfortunately, this is where our coverage of the match ends. You see, a fourth game was played, but not fully recorded. It was adjourned in this position you see here, which I'll put up on the screen now. This was the position on the board at the time of the adjournment. However, this game was never finished as part of the official match because Curt Von Bardeleben withdrew. He had claimed illness and thus decided to withdraw from the match. He surrendered the prize fund to Lasker and declared his opponent the winner. So that is a somewhat anticlimactic end to our first match. However, the players did later finish this in an offhand game, so let's go over that now. The sealed move that Von Bardeleben decided to play was rook to d6 check. If you're unfamiliar with the process of adjourned games at this time, the turn player, rather than playing their move, would write it down on an envelope and seal it. That way, when both players were analyzing their game in between the playing sessions, they would both be somewhat lacking information, right? So, for example, white would not know exactly what the move was going to be played, and so they would have to analyze a whole bunch of variations. And black, of course, would not know what white's response is going to be. So they're both analyzing from a rather equal position. Lasker blocked this check by playing knight to d5, and after king to d7, he played a very snazzy pawn sacrifice, c5. This opens up the b file after b captures on c5, and now rook to b7 with check. Now the analysts note that king to c6 does not work for black, because c4 comes, and now rook to g7 is on the way. Black can stop this by playing rook to d7, but after rook to b8, they have to contend with either rook to d8 and now rook to a8, and now this pawn is going to fall, or if you play knight to e7, then there's rook to f8, and now there's threats of rook to f6 with checkmate. It's a messy position for black regardless. So von Bardeleben instead decided to play king back to d8, and now c4 came anyway. The position was closed even further with f4, and finally Lasker played the move a5. Now white doesn't have an immediate win with this, but black basically can't move anything. And for the point of an offhand game, this is an absolutely miserable position to play, and so I'm not too surprised that it was here on move. I have absolutely no idea that Curt von Bardeleben resigned the game. So with that, our coverage of the match against Curt von Bardeleben comes to a rather unfortunate end. I assure you that the next couple of matches we'll be covering will be shown in their entirety. We will not be having any more withdrawals of this caliber, and so there will be much more chess to look forward to against players of the same level as Curt von Bardeleben here. So there's much more very interesting chess to look forward to, and I look forward to seeing you there. Until then.